In the early morning of December 7th, 1941, the American Pacific Fleet was attacked in its headquarters of Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, by 353 carrier-launched aircraft from the Japanese Navy. The attack was a success for Japan, taking the base by complete surprise. The American losses from the one-sided battle were heavy, including the complete loss of 3 warships, with 16 more sunk or severely damaged, which required long and intensive repairs to be reserviced. 169 aircraft were destroyed, and most importantly, 2,403 Americans were killed, with 68 being civilians. The Japanese declaration of war, which was intended to be delivered the same morning before the attack occurred, was delivered after the attack occurred, making the surprise attack a violation of international law and fueling outrage in America. Simultaneously, across the international dateline on December 8th, Japan attacked the American colonies of the Philippines and Guam, the British colonies of Hong Kong, Malaya, and Singapore, and the independent nation of Thailand. These attacks caused the largest turning point in American foreign policy in history, as the country went from an isolationist stance to a direct interventionist stance as a leader in global politics. In 1931, Japan invaded the Chinese province of Manchuria, which was almost universally condemned by the rest of the world. Japan formed Manchuria into a puppet state of Manchukuo. In 1937, Japan began the Second Sino-Japanese War with the goal to conquer all of China. Again, the actions were internationally condemned. The attack on Pearl Harbor, a major turning point in American foreign policy, and the war that ensued between the Allies and Japan was hastened by escalating Allied actions and the failure of the Allies to de-escalate tensions, which could have delayed the war in Allied favor. A major deterrent used by the Allies to curb Japanese aggression, but in fact did the opposite, was economic actions. The actions were designed to stop Japan's military and industry from getting the materials needed to continue operating in their war against China and in a possible future war with the Allies. Beginning on July 2, 1940, Congress granted the President the power to regulate the export of military materials with the Export Control Act, which President Franklin Roosevelt then exercised on July 26, 1940, issuing Proclamation No. 2417, blocking the export of aviation fuel and scrap metal to Japan. The embargo had little effect. Then, in September 1940, Japan moved into the northern region of French Indochina with permission from Vichy France, which was under the control of Germany. The movement into Indochina was to block the flow of supplies being shipped to China from America through Indochina. The following year, Japan moved through the rest of Indochina in July, again with permission from Vichy France. This move alarmed the Americans, British, and Dutch, as it put all of their colonies in Southeast Asia within range of attack from Japan using the naval and air bases located in South Indochina. In response to this, President Roosevelt issued Executive Order 8832 on July 26, 1941, which froze all Japanese assets in the United States, effectively making trade impossible between the countries, and most importantly, preventing the export of oil to Japan. Britain and the Netherlands took similar actions, which embargoed oil exports to Japan. According to the Imperial War Museums, Japan lost 94% of its oil supply following the embargoes. Oil was a key material for the Japanese military, as it was needed to fuel their war machines, and they could not hope to continue their level of operations without a new source of oil. According to the Pacific War Encyclopedia, Japan estimated it only had enough oil stockpiled for continued military operations into the end of 1942. The nearby Dutch East Indies produced 65 million barrels of oil per year, more than enough for their needs. So Japan decided that it must seize the Dutch East Indies, even though America was guaranteeing their protection, should an agreement not be met with the Allies. Other Allied colonies were targeted for their geographic value, such as the Philippines, as well as additional sources of materials, notably British Malaya being a major producer of rubber. The longer Japan waited, the less oil they had and the weaker they got, so it was imperative that they act swiftly. 4 months later, Japan attacked the Allies throughout the Pacific. The Allies failed to defuse the situation with Japan in the botched diplomatic negotiations between the start of the embargoes in late July and the surprise attacks in early December. Following the combined embargoes in late July, Japan decided on two different proposals to present to America. Proposal A to present first, and a secondary Proposal B to present if Proposal A was rejected. Japanese Ambassador Nomura presented Proposal A to Secretary of State Cordell Hull on November 7th, a month before the attack. The proposal outlined that Japan would withdraw from China except for the areas of Inner Mongolia, Hainan Island, and Manchuria, in exchange for normalized relations between America, Japan, and China. Hull and FDR refused the offer, even though a restored peace in Asia was a top priority of American foreign policy at the time. Nomura then presented Proposal B to Hull 13 days later on the 20th of November. Proposal B outlined that Japan would immediately vacate southern French Indochina and then completely vacate the province upon the conclusion of their war with China, again in exchange for normalized relations. This offer directly diffused the concerns of Japanese militarism targeting Southeast Asian colonies, but again it was refused. Hull presented a counter-proposal to Nomura on November 26th, which demanded a complete withdrawal from Indochina and China in exchange for normalized relations, effectively reversing a decade of Japanese expansionism. Japan saw this as too great a concession for the sacrifices that they had made. The demands were incredibly drastic, taking into account the fact that the oil embargo had only started because of Japanese entry into southern Indochina. The embargoes had given the Allies a huge leg up in negotiations, but they demanded too much, and the very next day, a carrier strike force set sail from Japan towards Pearl Harbor. A delayed war with Japan would have benefited the Allies because leading up to the attack, America was in the unfinished process of military and production expansion. On May 16, 1940, President FDR spoke to Congress and delivered his Ominous Days speech. In this speech, he outlines the evolving nature of modern warfare and how America must modernize and expand its military. He states, hyperbolically, that he should like to see this nation geared up to the ability to turn out at least 50,000 planes a year. The U.S. Army Air Force's Statistical Digest from 1945 provides data on aircraft production rates for every month from January 1940 to August 1945, and using the previous month of April 1940 as a baseline, America was only producing a yearly rate of about 4,800 planes. Using the data, it can be seen that airplane production rose steadily from 1940 all the way to its peak in March 1944, with a yearly rate of more than 100,000 airplanes per year. It is safe to assume that peacetime production would never have reached this much, but production was rapidly expanding in the year before the attack on Pearl Harbor and showed no signs of slowing. Then, on July 19, 1940, Congress passed the Two-Ocean Navy Act, which authorized ship production that would increase the size of the U.S. Navy by 70%, though the first ships authorized by this act to finish production only finished in late 1942, a whole year after the U.S. entered the war. On September 16, 1940, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, which started the first peacetime draft in American history. The U.S. military went from having 227,000 soldiers in September 1939, according to Warfare History Network, to having 2.2 million soldiers by December 1941, according to the National World War II Museum. Had war not been accelerated, all those factors could have better aided the U.S. With more time, the ships could have finished production. With more time, there could have been more planes stockpiled, and production could have increased even further. With more time, more soldiers could have been drafted, and the already drafted soldiers could have been trained fully, including the pilots for the new planes and the sailors for the new ships. The longer that America had to prepare before entering the war, the better off the Allies would have been against Japan. The attack on Pearl Harbor, a major turning point in American foreign policy, and the war that ensued between the Allies and Japan was hastened by escalating Allied actions and the failure of the Allies to de-escalate tensions, which could have delayed the war in Allied favor. War was accelerated by Allied economic measures on Japan. Botched diplomacy failed to delay war, and a delayed war would have benefited the Allies due to unfinished military and production expansion at the time of the attack.